Newborns, or you could also call them neonates, tend to be on average about 7.5 pounds, that's 3.4 kilograms, in our United States of America. And they tend to also be about 20 inches long, so 50.8 centimeters long. And for the first few days of their life, infants will typically lose some of that weight. They'd lose on average about 5% of their weight because they're getting used to eating things for the first time, like mother's milk, and they're also starting to eliminate waste. Now, typically this weight loss is not going to be a cause for concern, but if the baby is born prematurely, if the baby's born very low weight, then this can be alarming, and you might want to talk to a doctor about that if your baby is born too small in that regard. But this weight loss is definitely temporary, and the baby will quickly, adapt and start putting on the pounds. This will be followed by a rapid period of growth. Now, there's a lot of ways to test the health and well-being of your newborn besides just, measuring their weight and length. You could also look at their reflexes. So there are a number of these unlearned responses triggered by specific stimuli, and many of them have survival value. Not all of them do. Some of them actually seem to be precursors for later voluntary motor behaviors. And like I was saying, you can look at these in your newborn to see how healthy they are, how they're developing. So here's a list of just a few of them. The names are on the left. So first of all, you got the Babinski sign. That's when the baby's toes will spread out. They'll like fan out when the bottom of the foot is stroked in a forwards motion. And this will be lost around the time that the child starts to learn to walk. So around the first year. And the reason why babies seem to have this reflex does seem to be kind of related to walking behavior. So it seems to be like a precursor for walking behavior. When it comes to the blink reflex, that's just like a defensive reflex. That's a survival kind of reflex where the eyes will close in response to bright light or a loud noise, and that's never lost. You can see that in adults as well. Then there's the Moro reflex, where the baby will extend its arm outwards and then inwards, forming a C with the hands when they're falling backwards. It looks kind of like this. So if you have your newborn and they start to move backwards a little bit too fast, they'll thrust their hands out and then they'll bring it forward like this, forming this C shape with their hands. The significance for that seems pretty obvious. The baby is literally reaching out in an attempt to like grab something. So, survival, protecting themselves. Then there's the palmar reflex, where the baby will grasp objects placed into their hand. Then there's the rooting reflex, where if you lightly touch an infant's cheek, they'll turn towards that thing. That's like a method of finding food that they use. The stepping reflex, where if you hold a baby upright above the floor, they'll move their legs in a manner similar to walking. It looks kind of like a little bicycle motion, like they'll often do like this kind of stuff if you just hold them above the ground for a little bit. Then there's the sucking reflex, where babies will just naturally suck on things that touch their lips. So most of these do seem to have some pretty obvious application. But assessing these reflexes is just one method you could use. There's another method that's actually become pretty, popular. It's a standard way to assess the health of your newborn, and it's called the Apgar. So there's 5 scales in the Apgar. Each letter stands for a different scale. So Apgar stands for appearance, pulse, grimace, activity, and respiration. And on each one of these scales, the newborn infant can get a score of 0, 1, or 2. So for appearance, if the child has kind of bluish skin, then they'd get a score of 0. If their skin looks like a healthy pinkish color, there's a lot of red in their skin, then they get a 2. For pulse, if they don't have a pulse, that's a 0. If they have a pulse greater than 100 beats per minute, that's a 2. For grimace, if they're not reacting to stimuli, if they're just kind of neutral, they get a 0 for that. But if they're just crying and moving around a lot, like facial expressions, then that would be a 2. For activity, if they're just laying there limp and doing nothing, that's a 0. But if they're squirming and looking around and trying to interact with things, that would be a 2. And then for respiration, if they're not breathing, that's 0. And if they have a good, strong breathing, you can usually tell if a newborn has a good, healthy breathing because they have a lot of really loud crying. That would be a 2. So you score them on these 5 different things, and then you add up the score. And if the child gets a score of 7 to 10, then that means they're in good physical condition. We don't have anything to worry about. If they get a score between 4 and 6, now we should start to be concerned. The child probably has a problem and needs some kind of special attention. And if they get a score from 0 to 3, that's a life-threatening situation, and immediate action needs to be taken to save the life of this newborn. And there's one more way to assess the health of your newborn besides these other things I've mentioned. It's called the Neonatal Behavioral Assessment Scale. Now, I'm not going to show you a full list of all the things on the scale because it's much more comprehensive than these other things. It was developed by a researcher named Barry Brazelton, and we often call it the Brazelton scale because of that. And it includes a total of 28 behavioral and 18 reflex items, assessing 4 basic systems in the newborn: the autonomic system, the motor system, the state system, and the social system. So, respectively, it's how well can they regulate their body, what level of activity are they showing, are they able to maintain the state that they're in, and how well do they interact with others. But on the subject of states, newborns do have different states of being, like sometimes they have the state of what we call alert inactivity. So during this state, they have calm and open eyes, and they're very attentive, and they're just kind of checking stuff out. They're not really doing anything, they're just inspecting the environment. Then there's the waking activity state, where the newborn is not really accomplishing much, and they don't really seem to be inspecting the environment, but they do seem to be moving around a lot. It seems like they're trying to do something, but they just don't have the coordination for it. Crying is its own state for the newborn, so that's pretty self-explanatory. Shows a lot of agitation and crying. And then the 4th state would be sleeping. So that's pretty self-explanatory as well. So there's different versions of these various states, but those are the 4 basic states of a newborn. And when it comes to crying in particular, there are of course different kinds of cries babies can make. And you can group all those different kinds into just like 3 types. Like there's 3 basic types. The first kind of crying is what we call the basic cry. That's what a newborn will do whenever it's just kind of hungry or tired. It's a cry that starts softly and builds in volume and intensity over time. And I'd like you to hear it, so I'm going to play that sound right now. So when you hear something like that, that obviously means this baby is unhappy about something. You need to do something to satisfy this kid. Usually they're just hungry, but yeah, that's an unhappy baby. And then the second type of crying would be the mad cry. So this sounds very similar, it's just a more intense version. So here's what that would sound like. Now, the third basic type of baby cry is one that I am not at all happy to listen to. It's the pain cry. It starts with a loud wail, followed by long pause, and then gasping. You know, if you've ever heard this sound before, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It is just the definition of an unpleasant sound. It seems to like instinctively trigger something in people that just makes them angry or anxious. It's like we have this natural instinct to protect the baby. If anything were to attack the baby, it's like you go into, kill mode basically. So here's what that pain cry sounds like, and I apologize if this upsets you, but it's for science.
Hey, hey. Oh, princess.
So I hope you never have to listen to that in real life. Very, very unpleasant. Alright, so those are the three basic baby cries. But going back to that other state of sleeping, there are also different kinds of sleeping. And the way newborns sleep is not the same as how adults sleep. Just to name a few things, for example, a newborn will sleep on average about 16 to 18 hours a day. And their sleep cycle is also very different. They operate not on a 24-hour cycle like their parents do. They operate on a 4-hour cycle. So that means they're going to be asleep for 3 hours, and then awake for an hour, and then 3 hours of sleep, 1 hour awake, and repeat. This is why newborns, stereotypically will wake up multiple times during the night. This is part of the reason why new parents have such poor sleep. Their kid just isn't operating on the rules that Earth has set out. Like the kid needs to adapt to this 24-hour day-night cycle. And they do adapt. Over the following few months, this kid will start to sleep longer during the night, and by about 6 months, they'll spend most of their time sleeping at night. That's about 10 to 12 hours at night. And like I said, there's also different kinds of sleep. So there's non-REM sleep, where a person doesn't do much dreaming at all, and then there's REM sleep, where the brain is actively creating dreams. And for newborns, 50% of their sleep is just REM. So they're spending a significant amount of time dreaming. Their dreams aren't like adult dreams. It's hard to understand what a newborn's dreams might be like, but they're certainly having some kind of dream experience half the time they're sleeping. And then as they get older, that starts to get closer to adult levels. So by about 12 months, only 25% of their sleep is REM sleep. Now, this is an unpleasant subject, but something related to, sleep and baby's health and these issues we've been talking about is a kind of a strange disorder, something that happens that we don't fully understand, called sudden infant death syndrome, or SIDS. This is when a healthy baby dies suddenly for no apparent reason. Like I said, it's kind of mysterious. We don't really understand why this happens to some kids and not others. It happens to about 1 in 500 babies in our country. And it usually happens between the months of 2 to 4. So that's the point at which parents should be most concerned about this potential. Now, we have some ideas as to why this happens. It does seem to be that it might be related to sleep apnea. If you've never heard of sleep apnea, that's when a person starts suffocating in their sleep. And They'll wake up and they'll be, short on breath as a result. But maybe these newborns, maybe they are having the same problem, but because their body's still developing and the brain's still developing, they don't wake up. So they start to suffocate in the middle of the night, and they can't wake themselves up to fix that problem. So that seems to be a plausible explanation for this, but we're still learning about it. Now, we have identified some risk factors of SIDS. We know that children who are born prematurely are at higher risk. We know children who have a lower birth weight, parents who smoke, and children who sleep with a lot of excessive blankets, like children who are overheated. Like, all those seem to be related to a higher risk. But when it comes to trying to prevent this, the technique we've developed, the best word of advice we have for parents today is what we say, put your child back to sleep. That just means when it's time to go to bed, make sure the child is laying on their back. You don't want to strap them to the bed. You don't want to tie them down or anything like that. That can cause other problems. Just if you notice your child rolls over, just put them back onto their back. That's the best way to try to prevent this that we have currently. Now, to change the subject a little bit, something else about newborns that you'll notice is that they're different. Every newborn is a unique individual, and they're born with what we call a temperament, a consistent style or pattern of behavior. Now, temperament initially is inherited through genetics, but remember, those genetics will only become active if they're triggered by the environment. So temperament is the result of heredity and environment combined. So different infants will have different temperaments. Some are a lot more outgoing, some are a lot more introverted, some cry a lot more than others, some are just kind of easy going about it. They don't tend to get upset about things. So there's a lot of different temperaments out there, and a lot of this can be predicted, like I said, by looking at genetics. Now, as the child gets older, that temperament will typically be pretty stable. So you can, to a certain degree, predict the personality of the individual by looking at how they acted as a baby. Of course, you can change these kinds of things. Like I keep saying, it's up to the environment. So if, for example, you have a very shy baby, like the baby just doesn't like to be around other people, if you take this introverted child and you put them into play groups and you expose them to other people frequently, you can, help shape their development in that way. You can kind of counteract that inherited temperament that the child had. So a naturally shy child could become very outgoing as a result of these environmental experiences. And if you are trying to help your child, develop in any particular way, that is the best method you could use. Just expose them to those kinds of environments that you want them to be shaped by.